Good evening and welcome. This is the kickoff to the Spring 2025 Presidential Speaker Series. And as you probably noticed, the President is not with us. President Davis is under the weather. However, the First Lady joined us last night, and this morning we received a message that she too now is under the weather. So both of our speakers today are wearing Honorary President Mike stickers, and I thought just to kick things off, I'd reprieve an oldie but a goodie. For those of you who did not attend inauguration, not surprised that those props walked away at the end of the night. So, no, I am not President Davis. I'm Brian Salmeski, the Chief of Staff, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. Dr. Ashley Queensberry Stokes is Professor of Communication Studies and the former Director of the Center for the Study of the New South at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She earned her BA from Virginia Tech University, her MA from Wake Forest University, and her PhD from the University of Georgia. So pretty much a triple crown there of Southern universities. She teaches courses on Southern foodways, rhetoric, and public advocacy. Her areas of interest include rhetoric and public communication, Southern food and culture, food studies, identity and culture, and organizational rhetoric, corporate communication, and finally, social responsibility. Among her many publications are City Places, Country Spaces, Rhetorical Explorations of the Urban-Rural Divide, and Consuming Identity, The Role of Food in Redefining the South, both co-authored with our other panelist. And in 2020-21, she was a Fulbright Scholar, and she's also received funding for this research from the North Carolina Humanities Council, so pay attention, West Virginia. And as if that weren't enough, Dr. Stokes makes time to contribute to local and national media, such as the Smithsonian, Academic Minute, and National Public Radio. So, Dr. Stokes, welcome. Nope.
Thanks so much for having us.
Dr. Wendy Atkins-Sayre is professor and chair of the Department of Communication and Film at the University of Memphis. She earned her BA as well as her MA from Texas State University and her PhD from the University of Georgia. For those of you paying attention at home, guess where Dr. Davis earned his PhD? Dr. Atkins-Sayre studies rhetoric, focusing on the role that it plays in forming and reifying identity. Her latest book, Hungry Roots, How Food Communicates Appalachia's Search for Resilience, was, wait for it, co-authored with Dr. Stokes. And it investigates regional resilience using field work and rhetorical readings of food. She has also co-edited 3 books, City Spaces, Country Places, again with Dr. Stokes, Communicating Advice, Peer Tutoring and Communication Practice, a little higher ed rhetoric, and Communication Centers and Oral Communication in Higher Education. So I'm sure the Student Affairs contingent will be mobbing you after this. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Wendy Atkins-Sayre. With that introduction and my holding up of the honorary presidential face mask, I believe my work here is complete. Until we begin the question and answer, I'll kick that off, but we'll have a little less fireside chat than we did last semester since, again, I'm not President Davis in case any of you were confused by my costume. So, colleagues, please take it away.
I want to thank you all for having us and for welcoming us in such a fantastic way for the last evening and all throughout today. You all really make a honorary Falcon, I guess, feel very much at home, and I really want to thank Dr. Davis and his team for all that they have done to welcome us to campus and the great students we've talked to and the tour that we got to go on this afternoon and the Folk Life Center we got to explore and the food that we've gotten to eat and just a little bit of checking out the surroundings of the town that we're in. But it's just been a fabulous opportunity, and I really want to thank Mike for having us. And you had a clue that we did meet we met Dr. Davis at UGA, and he was part of a really wonderful cohort of people. And it's the connections you make in graduate school that lead to really cool things like this. So thanks again for having me today. So we want to note that, this book came out, we did some of the research for it during the pandemic, so largely we did a lot of this, and Wendy will talk about this in a minute, but research during 2019 through roughly 2021, and then we got to the writing process. But some of the themes that we're going to talk about tonight that were sort of happening at that moment of time, I think you're going to see the themes of resilience and communication happening in this region, and very, kind of the moment headlines and things that we're experiencing now. So, for example, in Western North Carolina, which is about 90 minutes from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, we're still dealing with the outcomes and the effects on the region from Hurricane Helene. And so you're seeing some of the resilience work in food there, ongoing right now. And then on the way here, some of the flooding that you're seeing in Kentucky and different parts of West Virginia and into North Carolina and Southwest Virginia, you see those elements of resilience as well. And so we're going to kind of highlight on some of the things that we observed about food and resilience during our research period, but we think they have a lot to say about how communities respond to challenges and the need for community building in whatever sort of historical time and weather event that we might face. And so what I'm going to let you start with today is Wendy's going to tell you a little bit more about the background of this project. We're going to kind of set up some of the work that we did and then take you through some of the examples that we drew from our archive of field research to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say that food conveys and communicates the area's resilience. So Wendy, you said the background.
I echo everything that Ashley said. Thank you so much, everyone, for welcoming us. It's been fantastic. We just need to come back and eat for at least a week because we have so many great recommendations. So background on how all this started. It did start in grad school. We were, as many grad schools have, there's one big room for all the GAs where, you cry together, you laugh together, you frantically have each other edit papers and such. And we had talked about doing research together, but just hadn't made it happen for a long time. So this whole line of research started from one paper where we would define some similarities. And what we discovered is Ashley, at the time, was doing some work on the slow food movement in Italy. And I was writing my dissertation eventually on animal rights rhetoric, and they had food in common from very different, directions, but they had food in common. We're both from the South, and so slowly we decided we should write a paper about how food communicates, and especially in the South, and what it says about the South. So then finding the text was a little bit tricky, and so I want to start with just talking about what is rhetoric, because that's the big approach that we bring to this research. That's our training. So rhetoric, in its broadest sense, is the study of persuasion, and so traditionally, in the kinds of ways that we were trained, you might do things like pick up the big speeches, look at the big movements. Maybe look at campaigns and those kinds of things. But in every case, it's picking something up and it's looking at it and it's reading it. How do you do that with food? And how in the world does food communicate? Well, we'll keep talking about that. But like a lot of disciplines, our discipline was starting to move away from just looking at words on a page and paying more attention to symbols in all kinds of ways. And so we knew that we could do it, but at the time, there's not a lot of people doing this in our field. Studying anything like food in particular was a little different. And then we had to go out into the field to do field research, which just didn't happen in rhetoric. The funny thing is we sort of made it up as we went along. We didn't know that at the exact same time there were researchers writing books about field research in rhetoric specifically. And so now we have all kinds of great resources. In fact, I'm teaching a class about it as we speak. But we really just kind of wandered through the fields for a while until we figured it out and what we were gathering, and we'll talk more about that as well. So the first book was Consuming Identity, and that was role of food in redefining the South. It looked at the South more broadly. And we covered so much ground with that. We knew that we probably needed to go back if we could and focus in on a more specific area. And if we did so, then we could really see what the food was saying specifically about that region. So why Appalachia? Ashley is from Appalachia. I am from Texas. So there was some persuasion happening between us, but Ashley's going to explain a little more about why that region.
Yes, and I think that one thing that will help is if we can get a picture of our map. Okay, I don't know if you all can see that, but I realize, and I think this is important for us to kind of kick off our talk this evening with this map and this discussion, that we're standing in a part of Appalachia right now. And so there are ways that you can talk about sort of geography of Appalachia. And so if you're talking about the mountain range, it can run all the way from Alabama up to New York State. You can talk about sociocultural perceptions about Appalachia and what do people mean when they say that region. You can talk about sort of insider knowledge about what one part of Appalachia might feel like than another. And so one of the things that I've learned today and yesterday, for example, is that some of the things that I grew up for part of my life in Blacksburg, Virginia, and Southwest Virginia, which is close to southern West Virginia and Beckley in that region. And so one of the things I've noticed is maybe the way that you talk about Appalachia in southern West Virginia might really differ from some of the things that I've seen here just in, 24 hours. So they don't have pepperoni rolls in Beckley, right? You don't have as much, at least visible sense of that Italian immigrant heritage in that part of Appalachia. So we decided, so Wendy's talking about how big the South is in our first project. We're trying to figure out, what does the South say about food in general if you were a visitor or if you're trying to market it. But then we first, kind of talked to some publishers. We want to write about Appalachia. We're like, well, no, we can't do that. It's hard for me to talk about this part because, I'd have to be up here a lot. I don't have a lot of connections to talk to people and do interviews. So we slowly got smaller and smaller with what we were trying to talk about in terms of our region for research. And so we're really talking about South Central Appalachia, which is the area in green that you see on the slide over there. And specifically, we were looking a lot about messages about Appalachia that you hear in the Blue Ridge Mountains part of the region. And we're looking about 100 miles, if you were to draw a circle around Asheville, North Carolina. Is the area that we're largely, with a couple kind of wiggle room kind of things, which we'll get to when we talk about. But one of the things that we felt was important in choosing this region is to make it smaller so that we could write and talk about it. And then also some of the stereotypes, which we'll talk about, and the perceptions about Appalachia as a whole, come from this sort of Blue Ridge Mountain pioneer Appalachia, the settlers who came to that region and then moved outward and all of these things. And so we decided to start there. But Dr. Mike has already written us today and saying that we need to come back to this part of Appalachia, and specifically West Virginia, and talk. And we could do a whole book about West Virginia food. So maybe we'll do like a version 2 or something. But that's what we're talking about today, because I think it's really interesting rhetorically for what Appalachia has to say. So, when we talk about Appalachia, if the South is sort of America's punching bag, I think that sometimes Appalachia, however you want to, carve it out, is sort of like the South. It's like the punching bag of the punching bag. And so one of the goals of this project is to kind of bring some new looks into our region, new conversation, some complexity, and some nuance. And so what we'll talk a little bit now is more about some of the stereotypes that you might hear about our region, broadly defined and in our specific area, and how food does anything with those and whether it does anything to those. So Wendy can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So if you Google Appalachia, pretty quickly you're going to come up with some gorgeous images, which I don't even need to show you, but we also give this talk internationally, so sometimes people aren't familiar with it, which is fantastic, and there's a lot to celebrate. But you know what else is going to come up pretty quickly, and it's going to be things like this. With the messages saying that people who live in Appalachia, especially southern Appalachia, are poor, They're all uneducated, they're backwards, they're conservative, they're largely white, they're unhealthy. I mean, it is really the stereotype of the hillbilly, which is oddly, embraced in many ways in tourist areas, even when it sort of hurts the region. But there's also, there's more to it, and it's partially the Scots-Irish pioneer myth. So anytime you travel throughout this region, you're going to see a lot of the imagery here. For example, there's the Tartan Inn in Linville, North Carolina, and some of the menu items we loved included tartan toast, Scottish jigs, those were drinks, the Loch Ness fish sandwich. I mean, they were fully embracing, this idea. There were Scottish clothing stores in the same area where you could buy kilts and tams. You could look up your own family crests and tartans. There were monuments, as you can see here, to Scots-Irish settlers, and even the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games, which we were fortunate enough to attend, so that you can go see the log throwing and the sheep herding and all the, and we had Scotch tasting, which was fantastic. But at the same time, there's also just this general pioneer myth imagery that you see everywhere. So, and it's the idea that the region is made up of, hardy people coming to America to find new land. They're struggling against the land to survive. They're fighting those elements and sometimes the natives. And they're surviving despite all of these challenges. So a little closer, maybe, to what was actually experienced, but still a problematic image of the region. So the stereotypes play a really big role. And that's partially because tourists, I mean, there are so many tourists to this particular part of Appalachia, 13 million visitors in 2022. And as they're traveling through the region, they're going to see all kinds of images, and it could be eating at restaurants where there's locally made Appalachian-inspired food. There could be the hokey hillbilly food, like the Hatfield and McCoy's restaurant in Gatlinburg, where the poor food is served in a rustic environment. Or it could be that you see really back to the land high cuisine examples. So in one day, traveling through one little section of Appalachia, you could see all of these images of Appalachian food. Those stereotypes not only harm the region for the reasons that come to mind initially, it really ignores the diversity of the region. It really silences all the people who made up the region itself. And so that's part of what we want to focus on through Food and Foodways, because it provides us the perfect opportunity to talk about the major influences. So that sets the stage for our larger project. And again, we should define what is Appalachian food. There's no one answer to that, but Ashley's going to explain that.
And one thing I want to point out is some of the images, most of the images that you're seeing on the slide would be part of our research methodology. So the pictures of us at the Highland Games, the pictures of the Appalachian foods that we'll show throughout the rest of the presentation are ways that we were trying to sort of capture what we saw. So, some of the things that we took pictures of, talking about sort of the mythology is, you're in a moonshine gift shop that's modeled after a shack or a barn, and it looks like a porch, and it's got the jug band playing, and it's selling potted possum in a can. You see the hillbilly back scratcher by the crackers, on the, it's kind of the sort of cheap convenience kind of gasoline food, heavy carb, heavy, some of the stereotypes that Wendy was mentioning. And what we found when we started talking to people from all over the region, whether it be, a gardener, we met 2 gardeners earlier today in a garden club, or if you talk to someone's relative, if you talk to a chef in the region, you start to sort of see beyond some of the kind of tourism-centric hillbilly stuff. And so, we could talk all day about whose definition we want to use for what Appalachian food can be or is. But, it can be a largely vegetable-driven cuisine that comes from a large garden in the area. That meat might be used more of as a condiment in a soup, beans, and cornbread dish, where there might be a little bit of bacon in there, but it's not the feature of the plate. It does include heartier meals sometimes, like soup, beans, and cornbread, and dishes that are made for comfort and to last all day because someone may be away from the home working all day and need the calories to do the types of work that they do. Things that come from the land that I've had conversations with some folks here today, things like ramps that grow in a particular region of the mountains. Venison and game might be part of that cuisine. Foods that are foraged, like mushrooms, could be another part of that. Grains that, so like I said, it's sort of like a smaller subset of southern foods. So you're going to see a lot of corn products because corn grows easily in the South and in Appalachia as well. You might see a lot of pork because pigs are easier to graze, especially in terms of history over time, than having a field lot for cattle, right? You need less space. They're more subsistence kind of animals that are easier to keep. I talked to someone earlier today about, growing up having chickens on Sunday, is a special kind of thing. So what we're trying to do with this project, I forgot, I should mention moonshine and whiskey, right? That's also part of the story. And one of the coolest things I got to do on this project is trying to figure out the Scotch-Irish settlement patterns into Western North Carolina, and then go to Scotland and see kind of like what comes over in wine. Whiskey is definitely one of them. And it comes into moonshine and tastings. And so there are all of these things that are analogous to the larger Southern food tradition, but also specific flavors and tastes like a ramp, like some of the mushrooms that you might see that are specifically, of this place. And the things that we were talking about here of this place may be a little different than what you might see in Southwest Virginia or North Carolina. But one of the things that we wanted to do is, and this was kind of hard at first, is we wanted people to tell us what they thought Appalachian food was. We wanted not our words to shape. We wanted them to kind of tell us what they thought it was. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do here. And then the other part that rhetoric allows you to do, we're not historians. So if you asked me sort of the history of the ramp in Appalachia, I could do that for you and go back and, and figure that out. But what we do instead is we're interested in how people talk about that ramp and how people talk about what they consider to be Appalachian food, right? And so we're interested in the messages that people share about it. And history is certainly part of that, but maybe in a different way than sort of like a fact-finding project. So sort of almost like a meta, what do people say about Appalachia through their food? So Wendy's going to talk a little bit more about our discipline, and then we'll get into some of our examples.
All right. So that brings us to the book, the newest book that came out April of 24. And so we do expand on the argument about food communicating and the rhetorical nature of food, but I want to stop there and explain a bit more about what do we mean by food and foodways. So Elizabeth Engelhardt defines foodways as why we eat, and what it means. And in that definition, you pick up on the symbolism, that we would try to get at through our research. But those symbols, so go back to the traditional definitions of rhetoric and what we study, that a lot of times speeches, for example, are very overt, vote for me, support this legislation, those kinds of things. Obviously, food is not doing that, but it does influence our identities, and that's a large part of what we study through rhetoric as well. And we talk about the constitutive nature of rhetoric, and all we mean by that is that the symbols influence how we see our identity, how we view ourselves, how we see ourselves connecting with others. And so food is a natural symbol that we would focus on because everyone eats. We may not eat the exact same thing, but we might, and usually we have these stories about the regions, and we find this influence that ties us together. So the other part of constitutive rhetoric and thinking about identity building is it's not just about influencing how you see yourself and others. It often then leads to action. So if I see a connection to you, we might pull together and act in a particular way. And so we're always also looking at actions and how it influences us. So looking at how food is used in your family, in your community, it tells you a lot about what's important, what you emphasize. So we get to the methods. How in the world did we go about doing this? It did involve a lot of traveling. As Ashley said, 2019 to 2021 or 22, it's kind of hard to tell when it starts and when it stops. But we obviously traveled through that part of Appalachia as well as Scotland, not me, just Ashley. But we gathered text through that field research. So we traveled, we observed, we did interviews, we paid attention to informal conversations, and then we also gathered texts that were a little more traditional. So, for example, public texts like speeches and campaigns and media and websites, social media, menus, blogs, magazines, travel brochures, all trying to see how others talk about the food, about the region through the food. We looked at public spaces like restaurants, farmers markets, grocery stores, museums, tourist shops, distilleries, and festivals. And again, looked for the symbols, talked to folks, did interviews, and also just in conversations, again, so that we could really highlight the voice of the residents. So once we had gathered so many of these texts, that's when we sat down and began to rhetorically analyze those texts, looking for themes that were emerging, and that's what led to our main argument.
Yes. And so we are, communication studies, you might see elements of sociology in here and anthropology. We've had some conversations with Brian, who's been an excellent host as well. But what we started finding when we're looking at our research as a body is that people and our texts and all of the things that we collected started talking and showing to us that the ways that food helped these different communities and areas within Appalachia be resilient or to attempt to cultivate resilience. And so we decided over time, using our research notes in our archive, that this element of resilience we kept seeing in different places all over reflected back to us. And what we began to see is that all of these food traditions and community festivals and histories that we have of a food in a particular place, like the Country Club Bakery or whatever, those symbols within a community both cultivate and reflect resilience. It helps bring maybe Fairmont together, for example. But there are also ways that sometimes that resilience rhetoric, when you see it with food, can pull you back. And you want to stick to the old ways and how we do things and kind of, we're going to be resilient and keep doing it this way. And sometimes those messages are, stymieing communities and maybe preventing communities or peoples from moving forward. So it's a term that both moves forward and to leap back. So on the slide now, you'll see sort of a, kind of a dictionary level definition, but we started to see this across communities and across our collection of research, that we are both moving forward and then this tendency to kind of come back to where you are, a sense of stasis. So, in a lot of Appalachian communities, you might see a sense of toughness, a sense maybe of stoicism in the face of a challenge or a crisis, a sense of coming together and building a community around each other through food or through lots of different community elements. So it can cultivate and it can move us forward, and it also can maybe keep us in place, maybe on a treadmill. You can maybe think of it that way. So what we'll do now is kind of give you 3 themes that we saw in our research that talk a little bit about this. So again, these are kind of across our body of years of field work in the area. We had the 3 themes of food helps us preserve our community traditions and habits. It helps fortify our sense of community-ness, maybe. It brings us together. It creates that community. It helps us be who we are through the foods that we eat. And then also this element that we saw in the South Central Appalachian region of all of these really interesting ways that traditions were melding together and then reflecting a new and maybe different story and providing new directions to think about Appalachia as a region. So we'll give you some examples.
Let's start with preserve, because that's definitely an image that you might imagine in this particular region. And again, we can look at the dictionary definition. Keeping alive, keeping in existence, protecting. But there's also the food element, where you're treating food in a particular way so that you're able to keep it for a much longer time. So think about the symbolism and the idea of preserving. There is some constitutive work that happens with that. Again, identity building work that happens with preserving. Because when you say that you're preserving something, you're also indicating that it's worth preserving, that it is important. And so you have all kinds of examples that of food that people still use, that maybe they make, but maybe they purchase. Why? Well, sometimes it's out of necessity, not as often today, but certainly out of necessity. You have 1 million tomatoes coming in or whatever it is, and you need to keep it because you know down the road you will need it. Sometimes it's out of tradition or practice. You're kind of reliving what you've learned over the years without even thinking about it. But sometimes it's even really intentional, where you're really trying to reenact some food preparation that you've seen, whether it's family or community or, even through media. If you wanted to feel closer to a region, you might think about preserving in this way. So when you think about the symbolism around preserving, you might think about canning, for example, the home version that you see here. That collection was amazing. Jewel, a family friend of Ashley's. And of course, we left with jars because you can't, go for a visit and not walk away with jars. And it was fantastic. But there are also these commercial versions or larger scale versions of preserves, as you see on the right there, which, are they authentic? We're not interested so much in defining what is authentic or not. It is about how it is communicated. So what are the signs saying around those products? You might also think about historic replicas of grist mills. Some of them even have demonstrations so that you can see how it was previously made. Museums and festivals celebrating food like sorghum and apple butter and ramps. I hear we need to come back and go to the ramp festival. Even things like seed saving and heirloom produce, those kinds of things also symbolize preserving. But I want to go into one particular example, and that is something that we experienced with Eastern Band Cherokee Indians. So we went to Cherokee, North Carolina. And as we did along the way, we often set up formal interviews as a way to get into the region and to meet people and to learn more about. And then it was always the things that came about from the informal things that happened along the way. So we went to the horticultural center there. We met with the director. We told him we just wanted to hear more about what they were doing. And so he started explaining that. But along the way, he paused and he said, What are you doing? I mean, we introduced ourselves. What are communication professors doing out here asking me about this, about horticulture? And so we told him. And he immediately said, you have to meet my friend who's a Cherokee food activist. And so, of course, what happened? We jumped into his truck, we drove across town, and we met Tyson. And we were invited back to to Tyson's house the next day to watch a demonstration, to watch an example of preservation. Of course, at that time, we didn't have these themes necessarily, but the experience was definitely speaking that. So what you see here is Tyson up front, Missy Crow, and Grandma Auntie Amy, as he called her. And what they're doing is demonstrating traditional Cherokee food preparation on Zoom to Western Band Cherokees in Oklahoma. So you're talking about people who had come from that region, who had been forced out of that region, who then didn't have access to a lot of the foods that would have been needed for traditional dishes. Then they lost the tradition of those making those dishes, and so they're coming together, through technology to be able to do that. So they showed them things like lye dumplings with broccoli sprouts and ramp salt, streaked meat, October beans, bear lettuce with strawberries. And they also put us to work, which I love. I don't know how much they trusted us. We were trusted to chop the strawberries. But we did very quickly learn that we weren't chopping them the right way. So we can tell you more about that if you want to hear. We then got to sit and watch the conversation, and even better, of course, at the end, we got to eat together and really talk about the food at that point. So they were really enacting preservation by growing and foraging this produce. They were native and traditional foods. They were buying foods from different vendors who were then, able to make a living in some cases or supplement through that work. And then they were showing others how to make the food. And so all of this can work together to create that sense of community. So whether it's sharing family or community recipes, or something completely different, you're learning something about the region by going through these steps of preservation. So the next thing that we talk about is fortification, and Ashley's going to move to that.
Every time I see this picture, and I've seen it, a million times by now, I just get so excited. It was one of the coolest things to be allowed to participate, and this moment of kind of cultural exchange between different communities was very cool through food. So fortify. So I have another fun one I think to talk about here. So not only can we preserve our community identity and our history and who we are with our families through what we eat, learning someone's family cornbread recipe, as I learned my grandmother's, for example, and I have her skillet in my kitchen now that she's gone, but we can also fortify our communities through food. So the definition is up there for you, but what we're interested in is the way that traditions and foods that we share fortify our identities. It fortifies, our shared experiences of people living in a particular part of Appalachia. And so on the slide there, you'll see it says Hub City Urban Farm. That's from Spartanburg, South Carolina. It was kind of on the edge of our little radius of research, but they had these amazing community gardens that they had created in an area of town that was experiencing a lot of blight, had a lot of businesses move, and they created a new space, a new cafe, a community outreach center, a children's garden, all of these things to draw people back into this part of Spartanburg and to create industry there through, local honey, through local jam, through the veggies that they were selling. The farmers market image on my right anyway, with the blue baskets, is in Asheville, North Carolina, an African American part of the city, and they had built a community garden kind of up a hillside in Asheville, and it was in a part of Asheville that had kind of been forgotten as they built the highway in. And so the Peace Garden was its name, and they had not only all these amazing, growing different crops, but how to cook with those crops. It was a pay-as-you-go donation garden. It had seeds that you could take. It had a lot of the community history that had been lost about Asheville. Asheville's a lot about breweries right now. You can't throw a rock without hitting another brewery. You can learn a whole lot about that, but that was kind of like the main story of Asheville. And so what this garden is doing is putting back in a different conversation about what it means to be kind of from Asheville, particularly from African Americans who've lived there a very long time. One of our favorite experiences too goes back to our experiences with the skinny, smaller communities of Appalachia. So the one that you're seeing on the slide now is from the National Cornbread Festival that we attended, and it is, part of sort of North Georgia. It's called Pittsburgh, Tennessee, right over the border into Georgia. And this is a festival that is sponsored also by Lodge Cast Iron, which is located in the town, and you can tour that. But they have an amazing festival every year. It's a small community, again, that a lot of industry had left. They start the Cornbread Festival, and it's like the whole town comes alive. so that you can walk down Cornbread Alley and taste cornbread dishes from people all over the community. They have a very well-regarded national cornbread cooking competition with sort of like Top Chef style from people all over, and they're using cornbread in very interesting and kind of creative ways. Some of the booths that you could try the different cornbread dishes would feature a community member, their recipe, and how they made cornbread, and they would talk about why their cornbread was better than the vendor next door. But what was really cool about it is all the proceeds of all of the different things. They had bluegrass music, they had, they have like a carnival part of it, but all of the fees and the donations that you would collect from the community go back into the community. So they get the baseball team new uniforms. They help the scouts go to different places. And so the Cornbread Festival, and we went to lots of these small festivals. We went to Chili Cook-Off. We did all kinds of stuff. But it was really cool to see how a lot of them featured a specific food item or food items, and they were used to fortify what the community was trying to do and who they were. And so a couple people told us, it's like, we look forward to this, talking about the Cornbread Festival again. It's a way to kind of show off and kind of get excited about who we are as a small town in the North Georgia mountains. So that was a really interesting thing to see. And then the last one that we'll talk about is fortification and preserving in terms of rhetorical action that Wendy was talking about often act really internally to a community. So you're fortifying the community internally, you are preserving histories internally to these small places or larger places. But then the last one kind of has more of an outward facing focus in that you're melding different traditions together to maybe get people to think about Appalachia in new or more nuanced ways.
Yeah, so earlier I said something about the stereotypes really erasing some histories. If the region is largely seen as white, as grandma's cornbread, those kinds of things, what's being left out is indigenous contributions with things like corn and bean-based dishes and greens. African influences from those who were enslaved, then leading to Black Appalachian or sometimes Afro-Latin roots, a term that was new to us. And then other European, as we're talking about this region being different, we don't hear those stories quite as much, and that's what melding is about. So if you think about the general definition, merging and blending, but then there's the food element, where it's the physical act of cutting or blending that generates taste and smells that weren't there before. And I love that part of the definition when you think about food and what it does to community. As Ashley said, the preserving and the fortifying, mainly internal, melding is digging into the true history of the region and telling the larger history there. So think about also the representation that happens on the streets through various restaurants and grocery stores that really are more produce and items in the grocery stores that aren't traditional, as we would see in the stereotypes, but in fact are becoming more common because population is changing in Appalachia. There are also chefs like Ashley Shanti in the middle there with the hat on the right, I should say, the middle picture on the right. And she has been an amazing Asheville chef who originally worked at a place called Benet on Eagle. That restaurant, everywhere you looked, it was everything from the food on the menu to the pictures on the wall to the music playing. The African influences on Appalachian food was really apparent there. She no longer works at that restaurant, although it's still there and it's fantastic. But this is her latest endeavor, and that's called Good Hot Fish, which I do understand was affected by the floods, but my understanding it's already come back, and she's already back out there doing it. So the other thing that you might think about is like Nikki's fry bread. Even though fry bread is a little controversial in Cherokee and other populations, but they are bringing these flavors to Appalachian festivals, for example, and pushing the boundaries of what it is. Or you might think about the whiskey moonshine story itself, and we're back to the hillbilly imagery. Except, let's go to this example. Are there any whiskey fans out in the audience? All right. So maybe you've heard, maybe you have not heard that if you're not. But Uncle Nearest is one of the biggest stories that we're talking about now from Tennessee. So the story is, and it's still relatively new history that we're digging up. And by we, I don't mean really we, but New York Times articles, for example, in 2019 started appearing. But Nathan Nearest Green is how he was known, was formerly enslaved, and he was known as the first master distiller, right? Which goes against the Jack Daniel story that you hear from Tennessee. The story is that Uncle Nearest Green, actually taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey. And Jack Daniel actually started embracing that story in 2016. And so the person who's now the CEO of Uncle Nearest, Fawn Weaver, she came across the story and she wanted to, celebrate it. She wanted people to hear it because it was a really positive example, and it so emphasized African roots in that region. So now they have this hugely successful Black-owned, women-led business, and it's really making waves in the industry. They're winning awards. They're being talked about all over. And of course, every time you pour a glass or buy a bottle, you might go learn about that story. They have a fantastic website, by the way, if you want to hear the story a bit more. But the distillery tour, so if you're walking through, you're going to see things like images of the family, because she actually brought the family back in to help make the whiskey, and it's actually on the land where Uncle Nearest was originally making that whiskey. You're going to see the T-shirt here is emphasizing the importance of reproduction of these food and drink of the region, and some of the placards emphasizing the African roots there. The other thing about Uncle Nearest is that the tourists to that place are very different than the ones that you might see in Sevierville and Gatlinburg, and so it pushes back against that one stereotypical story that we hear about the region. And that brings us to the end of the three themes that we traveled through. Ashley's going to wrap it all up.
Yeah, well, I will try. So, what does all this mean? At the end of the day, we talk about this a lot. It's just food, right? It's just a restaurant. Does it matter? Why does it matter that we're saying that food offers these themes, these different three themes that we've shared with you tonight about resilience? So we've talked about if something preserves, it's giving pride of place. If we've talked about how food fortifies a community, it's showing kind of a community spirit that can do actually, material actions and create change and build money for that, build funds for that community. We've talked about how going to Uncle Nearest or other sort of merged together foods and dishes gives us a new way to think about all of the different communities that make up Appalachia instead of just the one white pioneer sort of settler myth that you might be more familiar with, especially if you're not from the region. So we think that the resilience themes have a lot to say about the region and about what might happen for the region in terms of food and just broadly other changes that could occur. So again, we kind of offer this sense that resilience helps move us forward. It brings a community together. It helps us find strength in each other. It helps us see kind of like elements of nice nuance and self-confidence and good thoughts that maybe we didn't have about our places in which we grew up. But we also think that, resilience and thinking about all of the positive messages that these food experiences can send, the danger is, it's just a food message, right? So what I want to make sure to convey is that you have limitations with this rhetoric, right? That you need resources to be resilient. Right? So you can't just say, oh, food does all this great thing, and we think it does. But you also need to make sure that you're looking for the resources to help you move the community forward in ways that make sense. So there's a lot here that we think that honors community. It goes to community first to figure out what solutions are that make sense for that community. But without some resources and without being able to use that community appeal to talk outwardly, it may not do enough. And so I want to make sure that I stress that point. So I think there's a lot to be said for looking at the ways that food connects us to our places. It roots us to who we are. It brings us together. It helps create different perceptions of what we can be. And so with this project, we're really trying to illuminate maybe stories that people haven't heard before, tales that we don't often hear, and again, let people decide what they want to feature when you're talking about their region, rather just having that being imposed onto them. So we would love to have your questions and thoughts about what we've discovered and maybe what we can discover moving forward into our next regional food exploration. Thank you.
Thank you both. If you're like me, you looked at the pictures and you listened to the words and you sort of took a little trip. So as much as I would like to start with the whiskey, let me start the Q&A by asking you a little bit about your methodology. It sounds to me like it was very much participant observation, which is, I suppose, a gift from anthropology to other disciplines. But I think at the beginning you described it as sort of making it up as we went. So how can you help us sort of reconcile the fact that you didn't have a clear research design that might resemble something that a physicist or a chemist would have, and yet draw some conclusions that have validity to them and maybe engage in a little bit of that interdisciplinary sparring of prove it to me just because you saw it. And I think this is something that many of the social sciences are challenged with. So how did you do that with food and resilience?
So yes, I think one thing that we should point out is the field work, rhetoric in the field work part with food is the part where we're making it up where we went along. So that piece hadn't done that yet. So rhetoric is an ancient discipline, right? So we're going back to Aristotle and we're going back to Plato. And so there's very much sort of a very systematic process that we would follow if we're looking to analyze words on a page, right? A speech that a politician gives. So we are looking for particular descriptive features. Part of it involves figuring out what the context where that text was given, figuring out which of our sort of technical tools we can use to unearth a message, and then did it work, right? So all of those things are there, but they hadn't been put into the field in the same way. And this sort of started, I guess, our rhetorical fieldwork piece in 2016, and so there's more of it now. So that's kind of that you can go out and buy a book about rhetorical fieldwork, as Wendy was saying. But what would you add to sort of the systematic part of what we did?
Yeah, so I mean, we do borrow from other disciplines, definitely. People kept asking us, oh, this is an ethnography, or participant observation. And there's a lot of similarity, but I think it's about what you end up studying from your collections. You know, what are you trying to get at by looking at what we would call text as we're wandering through the region. And in our case, again, reading the symbols in order to find these themes. So the systematic part comes in the field notes. Just lots of images, actual notes as words as we were talking to people, recordings of conversations, those kinds of things. And then going back sort of systematically and looking for the themes. But rhetoric is about, the argument is the method. And that sometimes people have, even the students I'm teaching right now have a really hard time wrapping their head around that because we're told to have a methods section in a paper. So explain your method. Well, it's an argument. That's what we're doing. So I either persuade you with this argument or I don't. I either have enough data, we wouldn't use the word data, or I don't. So it's a little different.
And I think that's kind of the fun of it and the beauty of it. And I wonder, if someone did the same research that we did, they could come up with a different argument. And could they convince me using the textual evidence that they've collected of their different argument? And like she's saying with her students, like, wait, what? I can argue what I want if I've got the textual evidence to support it? Yeah, You can. That's kind of what we do. And so, I think that it's been interesting to ask people, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Do you see the argument that we're making? Have we convinced you using the texts and the samples and the evidence that we've collected of the point we're trying to make?
It's a great answer, that the argument is the method, and that you wouldn't call it data. And that you're not too concerned about the crisis of replication. So again, within the social sciences, lots of different approaches, I think is the key point there. I'd like to shift a little bit to that argument. So how do you test that argument? If you'll come back to actually where you ended there, Ashley. Asking the question back, are you seeing this also to your informants? Perhaps you don't use that word, subjects, research participants, whatever the vernacular is. How do you ensure that your argument is not just your argument, that you're not just projecting what you're seeing? I was sort of struck by how many different regions there were. And my mother loves to go to the Highland Games. She lives in one of those counties, and likes to talk about how her father's clan Hume, and I was raised with none of that. So she is projecting that onto our family history, and my brothers and I all sit around at the dinner table and say, I don't see it.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's an excellent question, and it's one that really bothered me as well, because I grew up hearing, oh, you're Scotch-Irish. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what does this have to do with me? So it turns out that, in fact, I am. And then one of the reasons I went to Scotland is I was looking at that particular pattern of immigration into the Blue Ridge Mountains. But to answer your question more specifically, I think you see the argument, I wouldn't say proven, because we don't do the same methodology, but you see these elements in the way that we would say the discourse changes over time. So if you were to go to Asheville right now, in addition to the breweries, right, you can look out and see many more examples of restaurants featuring African American stories and traditions and foods than you used to. If you read travel and food magazines like Condé Nast Traveler, and we track those, from the time that we started doing this research, it's like talking about going to, the hillbilly markets in Gatlinburg. That's still there, but you can pick up a lot of national travel media publications now, and they're like, hey, did you know that there was this tradition of Italian Americans in Fairmont? Did you know that? In addition to all the other things that you may know about West Virginia. And so what I would say is you could collect it's more like a longitudinal piece to it, that you could do a keyword search of articles that have come out about Appalachian food from 2019 until now. And I think I could prove to you that that conversation is slowly changing over time. But I can't tell you exactly when it is, and I can't tell you if it's enough, but I think you could pinpoint that the discourse is changing over time, is what we would say, partially.
And I would just add that, we present this nice, neat argument here to you, but of course those themes emerged after a year plus of wandering around the field and gathering the examples. So, I understand how you could see that happening, but I think by the time we made those connections, that's when we had all of the different examples, all the different texts. Yeah.
Well, I want to turn the word back to the audience, but I feel compelled to bring President Mike back into the discussion momentarily. And this is a true story. When I came to interview here in Fairmont, the night before, as I was packing things up, it dawned on me that my friend at one point, I was living in Kentucky over bourbon, because that's how you communicate in Kentucky, had told me that he was from West Virginia. And somewhere in the deep recesses of my mind, I thought he said he'd gone to Fairmont State. And so I picked up the phone. I said, Greg, do I remember correctly that you're from West Virginia? And he said, yeah. I said, and I remember somewhere that you said you were from Fairmont, right? He said, well, no, I was from Charleston, but I went to school at Fairmont State. I said, guess where I'm going tomorrow? So he gave me the 411 on Fairmont, and I got here, and President Davis picked me up to go to dinner, and he said, I forgot to ask, do you have an aversion to Italian food? Any allergies or anything? I said, no, I'm good with Italian as long as it's Muriel's. And he looked at me, and I said, I do my homework. So on that note of Muriel's and Dr. Davis, let's talk about your questions. You, the Appalachian lady in the back.
Is that good? Can you hear me? Okay. I am a lifelong Appalachian, raised by Appalachians. I want to just make a comment first. What I found really interesting about reading your book is that I'm from West Virginia, like multiple generations of West Virginia Appalachians, and how different the things you talked about were within our region. And I just thought that that was so interesting. But I guess I wanted to talk about, and I don't know if this area of Appalachia, I think we're a very hospitable people in West Virginia, but we're also not a very trusting people. My dad's only voting requirement for you to run for a state office in West Virginia is that you're from West Virginia. If you are Democrat, Republican, anything else, he doesn't care. If you're not a West Virginian, he will either not vote for you or not. How did you build trust in these communities that you interviewed? I know that you said you're from this kind of area, but how did you build trust with these different?
I mean, that's hugely important, right? And we try to talk about in the book, like, we are specific that we are coming from who we are as researchers. I'm a white woman, right, that I grew up in this area. And so we do talk about, so you bring that to, but to answer your question, I don't think we would have had the conversations that we had in certain places because they're like your dad. And, you can probably hear in my voice that I still probably sound a little bit like I grew up in Southwest Virginia, right? And so I think in the way that Brian is able to talk about, I'm going to say it wrong, Muriel's, but we've been passing it on the way here from our hotel. But he can speak that lingo, so then Mike talks to him, and I can speak the lingo. I think, but we did have people kind of look at us like, what are you doing? And actually ask us like, why are you taking all those notes? What are you writing down? Why are you, and we're really trying to say like, we really want to talk about what you eat and why you eat it in this area. And then people be like, oh, well, I will tell you that. So, I think that there is in our case anyway, there was a very useful insider-outsider dynamic, for lack of a better word. I'm not a chef. I'm not an insider in any of those kinds of ways. As I was quickly told, I was cutting the strawberry incorrectly. You're doing this wrong. So I can't claim any of that, but the geographical knowledge. But what was cool about that is I was insider enough, and then I'm home with my family in the mountains enough that I can still kind of know who belongs to who and who's people and all that stuff. But what Wendy offered is she would look at me, what? Like I would say, well, we need to go. There's a very small community, for example, called Meadows of Dan, Virginia. Has anybody seen it? It's delightful. Beautiful Blue Ridge Mountain. They have a gorgeous, very high-end resort there, but they have all these really lovely community stores that you can go visit and buy purchases. And then our family friend Jewel, who is the canner, that's kind of where she lived close to there. So I keep telling Wendy, planning this visit, I'm like, we're going to Meadows of Dan. And so it was like 6 months later, she said, that's 3 different words? And I said, yeah. And so it's like one of those things where I know, like I knew the community to say, we need to go here. And she's like looking at me like I'm, And so we had many moments where we're a check on each other, that what I see, because I am fiercely protective of my people. And that's a problem when you're a researcher, right? I've got to really look out for that. So hopefully my co-author can call me out on when I'm too much of the, insider language or voice.
Mm-hmm. I would just add one more thing, and I think it's listening. It's asking their stories and listening and valuing that. And that's what we do. That's how we gathered so many different examples, was just hearing people's food stories. And again, everyone loves to talk about food. So you can break through a lot of barriers, with that topic.
Great question.
I wouldn't necessarily think people wouldn't talk, but I know that at least West Virginians are really fearful of the way that we're reported and what we're talked about. And I'm sure that's happening down there too. So not necessarily being afraid to talk, but afraid of what you're going to do with it and kind of gaining the trust with those stories. So also, there's a town in West Virginia that's spelled hurricane. but it's hurricane. And that's the number one way we can tell. So if you're ever around there, it's hurricane.
Now we know. So if we ever write Mike's book, we'll be somewhat more ready. But yeah, I mean, I think it was really important to us. Like, for example, with the our Cherokee examples. I mean, we had conversations with those, community activists where we were very like, hey, we're working on this project. It may be years from now when you would read about our experience, but are you okay with that? And also to give those communities, buying their products, going to their restaurant, making sure that we are tipping well, that, that we are not just, because extraction, as a lot of us are Appalachians, that's a big thing, right? And so we were hopefully responsible and tried to be very responsible about not just taking community knowledge and stories, because lots of people are like, no one's ever asked me that. And so, I think some people do want to talk about it, but it's very important to be mindful about how you do it.
Hello. Oh. So my name is Jay Calsbury. I am 30 minutes away, and my family has been around here for years, and one of my grandfathers was Cherokee, but so it was like one of my great-grandfathers so far back that we like have theorized that he was from like the era where like the gold rush happened. And so he was like one of the very few that got to stay here. So when you had mentioned that you went down to like the Cherokee and like tasted their food and everything, you could probably tell that I was just like crying, because our family was just so distant from the Cherokee culture, because my grandfather, he basically had to hide his culture, his name, everything. And so I just wanted to ask, when you went down to the Cherokee, what was your like favorite dish down there that you tasted?
Oh, I'm so bad at favorites. But first, I want to say thank you for telling that story, because that means a lot. And that's amazing. That's really what we wanted to do, was to tell those stories that don't get told. I think the most amazing thing was taking really basic ingredients, and it was fresh. You just tasted the freshness. So the strawberries, I mean, it's probably because we cut it, but the strawberries were incredible. The ramp salt, I mean, I couldn't imagine what that was like until that moment, and it was bringing it all together. So much of it was new to me.
And I would say, I grew up, maybe some of you grew up eating sort of cornbread and soup beans, or, or brown beans, you might call them. I was talking with someone earlier today, and that was sort of a dish that's always in my house, like my entire life. At least cornbread, almost every meal my mom would make. But in that experience, you realize not only, like, how old some of these things are, that Native Americans are cooking with these things that then other communities adopted to make their dish, but also those slight differences. So the soup beans and cornbread that we ate that day, the cornbread's in the form of a dumpling that we've never tasted. It's completely different flavor. The beans had this ramp salt in it that they had taken all of this time to, distill the salt and infuse it with this kind of oniony garlic flavor. I'd never had that before. So, I mean, a dish that I've had like every week until I left home, right, tasted completely different. And it was almost like, chills, kind of like, whoa, like the sense of history and time and coolness of how it connects to this one community, and then it's spread outward in the region in all of these different interpretations. And I would say there's a great article for interest in that, and it basically is it's by a woman, Courtney Ballesteyer, and she talks about how the color of my soup beans aren't the color of your soup beans, but that's not the exact title, but isn't that cool? And so I think that there's this sense of, for me, this was really, I think, my first, I guess, fully immersive experience with Cherokee Indian food. And it just blew my mind. It was something that, again, I'd had all my life.
And I think, I mean, we really had moments after we were there, just sort of sitting in the car and not knowing what to say for a few minutes. But what really struck me is that Tyler, who we spent most time with, was really proud of being Appalachian. It's not like he was putting his, Cherokee heritage above Appalachian. He was clearly recognizing that combination. And also, it's not too late for you to, learn more about those traditions. There are great places you can visit, and I'd hope you would.
I already have begun researching about those traditions and researching about the different language. And one last thing here, I am also Scottish and Irish, and I highly recommend the McCater's restaurant down the road. And if you're here for like St. Patrick's Day, they literally cook like a traditional Irish dinner not dinner. Irish, they don't do dinner. It's like a traditional Irish lunch that my mom has said that is very much amazing.
Well, I think if you'd like to, we've got a couple of websites and authors that we have another activist that we met that she runs the Oklahoma, the Eastern. It's Eastern Band, and then Cherokee Indian is the Oklahoma band of Native Americans. And so I can point you to her website, to her, and her whole project is bringing back all of these things that have been lost. So you can share with me the address of the restaurant, and I can tell you, some of the things that you can check out to kind of dig into some of this.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bryson. I live about 2 hours east of here, and my question is probably more generic, but before I get to that, first I'd like to thank you for being here. You stopped by one of our classes earlier today. I enjoyed your presentation thoroughly, and I came back this evening just to hear some more about it, because, at least for me, I love to eat, and so every time I go, to the cafeteria or whatever, it's pretty thankless action throughout my day, but when you do really get to think about it, you get to see some of the things that food has to say in a way. But my question is, throughout this whole deal, what is one life lesson that you've learned that you would share with us? Maybe you learned a lot, I'm sure you have, but what is one you'd like to share with us?
Maybe it's connected to the listening and asking stories. I feel like the best examples that we collected along the way were not planned, and they only came about because we stopped to talk to someone, and we listened to what they were saying. And so, when we ended up going to this person's home and getting that experience, or wandering a back road because someone said there was something interesting down the road. I think we learned a lot from it. And when going back to we were trying to make it up as we went along, we did figure it out, early on. But the mistakes we were making before, and I think I mentioned that this morning, is we had too much scheduled. We were choosing things that other people had told us were really important parts of the region. And when we stopped planning and just actually listened to the people, I think we learned so much more. So I think that's a major life lesson.
She kind of stole mine, but I guess another way to look at that, and I think they are slightly different, is being able to be uncomfortable and not knowing the answer to something. I've been in academia, for a long time now, and it's not a good thing if professors don't know the answer to something, right? We're supposed to know in our classes and things. And so with this kind of project, you kind of have to sit with not knowing and being uncomfortable. Like some of the experiences that we were invited to participate in, I mean, you really, it's very different, and it feels awkward, and you don't know what's going on, and you might get fussed at while you're doing it. But just being able to kind of sit with not knowing the answer, and it took us a long time to kind of figure out what we were looking at, and I think that hopefully the ability to not rush to prove a conclusion that you were looking for and just kind of letting it sit there for a while, and I think that's good for the students to listen to too, that it's okay not to know, and it may take a while to figure it out. And I think that that's a luxury that we all should kind of give ourselves, in particular situations, to kind of sit on things and think about it for a while, maybe.
So, when I was growing up, I wasn't even sure that I was allowed to eat at Muriel's. Like my family's Italian, and my grandma was cooking and baking enough bread twice a week to feed her entire community. So, I like Muriel's, by the way. Did you ever face any hostility from immigrants or even natives for the idea of people like marketing and selling their culture and traditions?
Yes, I think that the easiest place, like the first thing I thought of is, I mentioned earlier kind of this notion of extraction, but particularly I would say in kind of the region that because it's not a coal region, it's a different kind of extraction, but I felt it most acutely when we did the work with the Cherokee. Because, and we had conversations, very specifically about how we were going to talk about that story, what we were going to do with it, what was our point with this. And so, again, just being really honest about what we were doing. But yes, I think there was some, because the reason that we even ended up at the, the shared Zoom experience was completely random. And here we cruise in. And, this was something that had been planned for a very long time for that community, and we just kind of paused. So definitely it took us a minute, and I think several conversations to make sure that they felt comfortable with what we were after. I'm trying to think of other ones where I felt it, where we had to make sure to be really clear about it.
Yeah, there was also, this isn't anger with us or distrust with us, but I think there were many heated statements about Appalachians who buy into that stereotype in order to make money, so that's like the Gatlinburg places, right? Because it does make money. And so we heard that a lot, that people were angry, that or disappointed, sad that it was being represented, the culture was being represented in this one way, and that they were trying to fight back against us. But they appreciated what we were doing in that case, which was moving away from that one image. If there's anything else.
I think those are probably the two main things I would think about, that we don't, once people realize that we weren't trying to market or sell kind of that old kind of hillbilly kind of stuff, and realize that wasn't our point of talking to them, and that we were trying to, like she said, to complicate and to add some nuance, I think people were more willing to talk. And sometimes they didn't, though. There's a lot of failed experiences. They don't make the book, but we had a lot of, we're not doing this today. We don't know. And we just drive off, So it definitely, and that's, I think, it goes back to the uncomfortable part of it, to sit with it. It doesn't always work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and studying food is fantastic. We had a great time, but there were those days where it was like, I don't want to go to another restaurant. I don't want to eat another thing. I know the problems that we have with our research, but still, yes, there were definitely many failed days or hours. Yeah.
Professor in me is saying, wait.
Another one, good.
That's why they taught that to me in graduate school.
It worked.
Sort of, speaking of cornbread, I was on the road on Sunday and driving back to Fairmont. I was listening to NPR, the food show, The Splendid Table. The guest was Crystal Wilkerson. She was talking about her book, Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, if you know that. I guess it came out about a year ago. Anyway, she was talking about cornbread, among other things, and she said her granddaughter called her up and said, can you give me the recipe for cornbread? And she said, no, I can't. It's like, I'd have to be there. I'd have to see, what kind of cornbread? What else are you eating it with? And so there's a lot of subtleties. I thought it was, just very interesting, beautiful story about, I have to see how you're kneading it, how you're mixing it. I have to stand there next to you. And so, it's not just a recipe, it's the whole experience, which, was communicated, which I thought was a very nice story.
I love that. I mean, cornbread's really important to me and my family as well. And the funny thing is, I took an oral history course as a master's student, and one of the things that the professor really wanted us to do was to go collect family food stories. So I guess there was a start to that. But I did go collect the family cornbread recipe, but it was exactly that. It was my mom saying, just put this much, what fits right in here. That's how much salt you put in there, and milk. How much milk until it's wet? Okay, all right, thank you. So it's, love that.
And I'm so glad that you brought up Crystal Wilkinson's work. She's winning many awards for that praise song of the Kitchen Ghosts book. And even cornbread, I think, is just one of those things that it lets you talk about all of these different things. Our first book, we had this whole, we would talk to people like, cornbread should never be sweet, ever, ever. But then we talked to who gets to make that decision, and we talked to African-American writers that perception has been decided sometimes by the discourse that's surrounded it and who gets to make that call, right? And so some of the reasons, for example, that sweet cornbread might be popular in more northern regions after the Great Migration is the quality of the cornmeal wasn't as good as what it might be in certain regions of the South, so the sugar's added to kind of make up for the lesser cornmeal item. And so that's why that became a taste preference in particular regions and among particular communities. But isn't that cool? Until you know that, you're like, oh, because my family, you don't dare put sugar in it. But now I know kind of more about why those decisions are made and who gets to claim it. So I think she does some beautiful work about kind of adding layers to these conversations.
We're coming up on our time, and as you walked in, you probably saw that there is a reception set up. Our amazing caterers from Aladdin asked for some inspiration for this evening, and then I think went ahead and took it to the next level. So we'll have a little bit of Appalachian and Appalachian-inspired food when we're done. But first, on behalf of President Mike Davis, that really echoes when you hold that up, we'd like to give you both a small token of our appreciation for coming to Fairmont, to visiting Fairmont State, spending time with our students, with our faculty, and with us this evening. So thank you so much.
Looks like a big token. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh. And thank you for coming and for being so hospitable. It's been wonderful. So I'm looking forward to talking to you out there and eating some good food.
I think the gift is coming here. This has just been an incredible campus, and y'all have got lots of really cool things going on here. And so to have this on top of everything, we really appreciate it. And there was even cornbread on the table last night. So the attention to detail has just been awesome, and everybody has been wonderful. And thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Let's eat.